why are we pushing necessarily something that the next sentence is, let me tell you what that isn't? Guess what we have to do? You say, we're heading around explicit instruction. Let me tell you what explicit instruction isn't. And we have to say explicit instruction, explicit direct instruction. It's not this. What we mean is this. Is there anything else you try to convince 100,000 educators about where you have to, the second sentence, say, it's not this, it's really this?
So good morning, everybody. My name is Glenn Fay. I'm the Director of Education here at the Centre for Independent Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here. For those who are regulars and those who are new to the CIS, a very warm welcome on a fairly cool morning. We've seen something of a revolution underway in recent years. One grounded not in fads or ideologies like we've seen in the past, but one based on cognitive science, rigorous classroom research, and a growing clarity about what effective teaching looks like. This science of learning that we've come to speak of is an interdisciplinary body of knowledge drawn from educational psychology, cognitive science, and classroom studies that tell us what helps students store, retain, and apply new information. It reminds us that learning is really hard work, that memory matters, and that the teacher's role is central, not incidental, to student learning success. For years, these ideas have been part of a research base, but hadn't always made their way into classroom practice. But now, across many Australian classrooms, we're seeing a really meaningful shift. Teachers routinely practicing with efficacy the teaching practices of explicit teaching. More schools embracing what we would call a knowledge-rich curriculum. And more system leaders recognising that well-structured teaching is not a constraint on the creativity of students, but its foundation. The shift hasn't happened by accident. It's a result of growing pressure from teachers, from researchers, from policymakers, many of whom are here today, to bring classrooms into alignment with the science of how children learn. And it's also driven by a stark reality of Australia's declining educational outcomes and a need to address those outcomes and also stubborn educational inequalities. At CIS, we've proudly contributed to this movement, from publishing research that challenges unproven teaching methods to highlighting the success stories of schools bucking the trend, and also calling out initial teacher education programs when it comes to those who have missed out on providing the foundational knowledge about cognition and effective instruction that we know are so important to success. There's still a long way to go. Too many teachers still complete their training without learning the essentials of how the brain processes new information. Too many classrooms still fall back on methods of discovery-based teaching practice, even when they serve students who need effective teaching the most. And too many policy documents still use vague language that talks about student engagement, teaching innovation, but often misses out on the things that really matter most to impacting student outcomes. And that's why conversations like today's really matter. They help sharpen our thinking, reflect on what's working, and push the reform agenda forward with urgency and clarity. I'm very pleased to welcome two outstanding guests this morning, both of whom are international leaders in bridging research and practice in education. Dr. Carl Hendrick is Professor of Evidence-Informed Teaching and Learning at Academica University and the co-author of How Teaching Happens. And Dr. Simon Breakspear is the founder of Strategic Schools and the co-author of Teaching Sprints. So without further ado, please welcome Carl Hendrick.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn. It's a real honour to be here at I think a very exciting time for Australia. In the 1890s, William James gave a series of lectures to teachers, travelling from Boston to Chicago to Colorado Springs, speaking to thousands of teachers in an attempt to make his psychological research relevant in the classroom. His focus was on applying the emerging science of psychology to the art of education. And this was at a time when phrenology was seen as a respectable science. But James observed something which I think is quite prescient. Quote, although psychology cannot produce teachers directly, and his claim was that psychology was a science and teaching an art, it can assist educators in avoiding mistakes and in understanding the minds of their students. And more than 130 years later, we face a question that should give us pause. How is it that after decades and billions of dollars spent on education research and intervention since James's time, why is it have we systematized many of those mistakes and still see stagnating student performance across much of the developed world? Even more concerning is the fact that many of the insights we have based the broader science of learning enterprise on, such as explicit instruction, cognitive load theory, and retrieval practice, we've known them for over 70 years. And I'd like to explore why that is. So education, unlike medicine or engineering, remains a profession where we have a sort of ambivalent relationship with evidence, or at least to certain kinds of evidence. It's sometimes argued that education is too complex for evidence-based models. But if health, which is an even more intricate and biologically variable domain, can adopt evidence-informed practices, so should education. Complexity is not an excuse. It's a reason to systematize knowledge. Education and health are twin pillars of a functioning, equitable society. Both absorb large portions of public budgets and are central to national well-being, productivity, and cohesion. And just as we demand that public health intervention should be guided by not just evidence, but certain standards of evidence, we should expect the same of classroom instruction. In medicine, when research demonstrates that a treatment works, it gets adopted. When it doesn't, it gets abandoned. This is not the case in education. And as the great Douglas Carnine observes, in medicine, beliefs follow evidence. In education, evidence follows beliefs. And while medicine operates with a clear ethical and scientific set of standards enforced through licensing and accountability, and most critically an agreed body of evidence, education is still a Wild West landscape in many systems. In schools, we have non-negotiables when it comes to safeguarding, and rightly so. But when it comes to curriculum instruction and assessment, we often have this buffet-style approach where teacher autonomy, fads, and ideology have been privileged over what might work for students in their charge. Now, this, I claim, inverts the proper relationship between evidence and practice. Practice should follow evidence and not precede it. Some will argue that education is in fact too complex for simple experimental approaches, such as randomized controlled trials, and that we need a more nuanced understanding. Indeed, as James March observed, God gave all the easy problems to the physicists. And to be clear, nuance matters, but too often words like nuance and complexity become a shield against action rather than a call for clarity. And I say this as someone who completed a PhD in an education department. A lot of education research is speculative in nature, and it resembles what Frank Chioffi, his critique of Freudian analysis, which he calls a testimonial science, a body of literature composed of selective anecdotes, ideological endorsements, and internal assurance rather than replicable, cumulative evidence and testable claims. Yes, education is complex, but complexity doesn't exempt us from the obligation to determine what works. And this isn't a call to abandon all creativity or innovation. It's a call to anchor these things in what we know works, especially for the students who can least afford this experimentation. So what does the science of learning actually tell us? Well, I was 5 years into my career as a teacher, working in an inner city London classroom, and I really had no clue what I was doing. I was engaging in practices that were in the words of Wolfgang Pauli, not even wrong. I was given answers to questions I never asked, such as, how do you provide learning for students with different learning styles? And when I came across the works of Sweller, Kirshner, Clark, Willingham, Ausubel, Miller, and others, I found it a liberation. Finally, I had a blueprint for why my students were struggling so much. And more importantly, I had a roadmap for how to help them. And through their work, I learned a number of things. I learned that working memory doesn't actually work very well. I learned that retrieval isn't a test of learning, it is learning. I learned that memory is reconstructive, it's not reproductive. That motivation matters, but we probably have the causal arrow the wrong way round. Effective instruction is, in fact, the best motivator. I learned that skills are largely domain-specific. I learned that learning and performance are not the same thing. That learning is not what happens in the lesson, it's what happens after. And probably the most important thing I learned was that novices don't learn best by discovering things for themselves, which is what I was inculcated into during my PGC year, my postgraduate certificate in education. I learned that confusion is not a rite of passage, that misconceptions don't correct themselves, and that chaos is not creativity. But these things were made clear to me by evidence, and evidence that was cumulative in nature. I came to see that clear objectives, high expectations for attention, and explicit instruction were an act of great care, not just professionalism. In Australia, as it moves towards this, if it is to be a revolution, has some good examples from which it can draw. Internationally, in England's phonics check in year 1 has served as a tool and a model for anchoring reading instruction and research, providing a clear early diagnostic tool to ensure that students are developing decoding skills. It created system-level accountability and empowered teachers with timely data. Literacy outcomes improved significantly as a result, especially among historically underserved groups. The establishment of the early career framework meant that all new teachers in England must now receive training grounded in cognitive science, including working memory, cognitive load, and strategies like spaced retrieval and explicit instruction. And I'm very encouraged to see very positive signs happening here. The Victorian Teaching and Learning Model 2.0, the work by Aero has begun translating cognitive science principles into practical tools for schools, guides, frameworks, and implementation pathways. So where does that leave us? Well, we'll explore that in detail this morning, but I feel we're at an incredibly exciting time, especially here in Australia, where many of the leading voices in applying the science of learning are gaining so much traction. And if you'll permit me to return to William James, over 100 years ago, he warned us, "You make a very great mistake if you think psychology, being a science of the mind's laws, is something from which you can deduce definitive programs and schemes and methods of instruction for immediate classroom use." And this is the challenge now which we all face. To take those hard-won insights about how learning happens and to translate them into a lingua franca that teachers can understand. And right now, this is where we find ourselves, in that interstitial space between evidence and practice, where it's so easy to develop those lethal mutations. And this is why consistently evaluating impact against the broader evidence base is so critical. So if there is to be a revolution, then it must not become a technocracy. And we should beware the zeal of the convert. It should hold ourselves to the same standard of evidence that defines every other mature profession, while recognizing that the art of teaching requires wisdom, judgment, and informed adaptation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carl. Well, I actually grew up here in New South Wales, and when I finished school in 2000 and did better than I thought I should have done, there's only two jobs or two university degrees you're meant to do in Australia. It's either law or medicine. My brother had gone into law, and there's a word to describe people like that. Rhymes with bank if it starts with a W, and I thought I'll do the other one. So at University of New South Wales, I enrolled in medical degree. And we were keen to use science to impact practice. We wanted to think about our practice as future doctors. How could we build relationships with patients? And yet, unfortunately, our lecturers said to do that, you've actually got to understand anatomy. You've got to understand basic structures. You've got to understand mechanisms. You've got to understand physiology and biochemistry. And to have an impact on the lives of people, you have to understand the structures and mechanisms you're actually trying to enact. Well, at the end of that year, I saw the light, not so much because I didn't love science and impact, but I saw an opportunity to go back into education. I made the best decision at that point, though. I actually did a 4-year honours psych degree, and I couldn't really imagine actually going back and doing a better thing. And as I started to get into that degree, I thought I'd try to earn some money. So I went and taught study skills at high school. Has anyone been in one of those sessions before? You know, you pay for someone else to go in so you can go have a coffee outside. And I would teach them about spaced review, interleaving, retrieval practice. Don't just keep rereading your notes. Don't just highlight them. Active engagement. And every now and again, a student would come up and say, "Can you tell the teachers these things? You tell us to do spaced review and interleaving, and yet they just set the homework for the day that they've just done." When I started teaching, I was allocated a mentor, an amazing, passionate teacher. You know, you get feedback on a lesson and you'd say, "Oh, how did you think I went?" "Oh, it was great. I loved what you did with those kids." I remember asking him, you know, "How do you judge the impact of your lessons?" This is a bit disgusting. Sorry, Carl, this is very Australian. He says it was about the size of the sweat patches under his arms as he walked out. Because for him, great teaching was passion, it was charisma, it was connection. But it wasn't really about precision. Well, in about 2005, I got really interested in how to have an impact beyond one school. I went off to the UK, and at that point, when you think about studying evidence, it wasn't about the evidence of practice. It was all about evidence of high-performing school systems. And so in 2009, I thought I'd better study PISA. Remember the days when everyone was like, "Oh, evidence for how to improve schools, better go to Finland." That was some great sabbatical trips for people. In 2010, when I was at the OECD doing an internship there during my PhD, someone said, "Have you seen the data?" I said, "No. Shanghai's absolutely kicked the world's butt." And there were years we spent talking about evidence, but it was very up there evidence. It was reading the policy tea leaves, turning up in places and saying, "Oh, Ontario did this, England did this, Shanghai did this." And we'd sort of study these broad things, but no one was really talking about the classroom at all. I remember in 2013, I'd taken a bit of time out of my PhD. I didn't actually tell my supervisor, who was a bit annoyed about this, and I spent a year working for Sir Michael Barber. I thought, who is someone who's been on the ground trying to do large system change? Who is Tony Blair's chief education architect? And I got to sub in for some of his meetings because he was meant to be everywhere. I remember in 2013, this is 2 years after the Education Endowment Foundation was founded, and Ben Goldacre was doing a paper around building evidence into education, talking specifically about how we could learn from what happens in medicine and build that into education. I thought, actually, this is the path to improvement. When I got back to Australia, what I noticed is none of the universities were involved at all in applied work. In 2014, 2015, no one was offering short courses on the science of learning and explicit teaching. Even my own former university, and now where I'm an adjunct, John Sweller's work was sitting there, beautifully sitting there, not mobilised at all to anyone. So in the last 10 years, I've spent time trying to work out how do we move from the first movers to everyone else. And I really can't believe how far we've come. Do you remember 2020? Like when it was fires and then plague and then flood and then more plague? There were 3 years there where no one was allowed to open their mouth and say, "Hey, I think we should talk about practice improvement. I think we should talk about improvement." It was, how do we help people? How do we look after people? And suddenly on the other side of that, we are having an absolute renaissance, an unexpected renaissance about improvement. One of my colleagues, who I won't name, was on a project with me in the Victorian government in 2023 when she wrote a terrific op-ed saying, to solve equity, we already know the answers. It's not easy, but we've got to do it. Basically saying Victoria should sort out their stuff on evidence-based approaches to teaching, reading, and teaching more generally. I was quietly recommended that she was no longer on the project as we moved into the next year. Oh, how far we've come. She's just done an entire review on the request directly of the minister. It is utterly surprising to me that we are having this conversation, and I wouldn't have put good money behind it at the end of 2022. So given I spend all of my days in schools, in large systems, in Melbourne Catholics, I've spent 8 years now doing about 15 to 20 days a year working alongside each of their regions. I spend 20 to 25 days in Victoria supporting their network leaders who are in charge of implementing the Victorian teaching and learning model. All of my work is in the applied side of not so much just what are the findings of evidence-based instruction, but I want to challenge us today, will we not also use the evidence about how to help people change what they do? So let me give you 5 things that I'm learning briefly here about how to maybe navigate this interstitial space that we're in. Well, the first one is the first movers talk to themselves all the time. It's very energizing. The same 500 to 1,000 people are at the majority of the conferences, and even last Thursday night, I was so fortunate to join OCA for a paper they released, and I've got multiple faces in the room. I saw you last Thursday. People who are at Research Ed are also at Sharing Best Practice. They're also joining Nathaniel and colleagues at Think Forward Educators. They're this wonderful first-moving group, and we need to activate and energize them and learn from them. But you also need to know that the energy of that group is also creating an equal and opposite reaction. I've also been at lectures from leading universities putting out ideas that are counter to this. And those rooms are full as well. People are choosing their chosen prophet and quoting their chosen professor at each other. So how do we move the middle? First, start with real problems, not prescribed practices. When I work with educators, I sit and I talk about the problems that emerge from their understanding of the learning sciences. Does anyone here have problems with attention? I've got problems with some of your attention even now. If you can talk to any high school teacher with any device in the room, they'll say, oh, this is the number one thing I face. Attention, attention, attention. They want to talk about working memory. They'll want to talk about students forgetting things that they've already taught and how frustrating that is when they're trying to get ready for the HSC exams. And I've already taught that and there doesn't seem to be any evidence at all that it's there. When we start to talk about the problems that they face, and then I ask them, what are the strategies you currently use to solve that problem? How effective are they? Are they working for you? Would you be open to exploring what our field collectively knows about finding an approach that might actually work? 2, when I face resistance, I often find my edu friends online ramp up into a dialogue and discussion about my evidence versus yours. And that's great in those lead mover groups. I get energized by being shown I'm wrong. But when we love and care for our colleagues, when we truly want them to move, not just to be right, we've got to realize that often that resistance is coming from a deep concern about students. They watched Sir Ken Robinson. They assumed he knew what he was talking about when it came to cognitive science. And they know that schools kill creativity when they do the types of things that you're telling them to do. And so actually when people are pushing back, I often don't try to say, oh no, explicit instruction is correct. I say, tell me more about what you understand about learning. We need to loop for understanding. We actually need to spend time helping them explore their own views of learning, because even though teachers talk a lot about teaching, they often don't have well-articulated theories of learning. When I find pushback about a practice, I normally say, oh, I've got to go below the line. We might not agree together about our understanding about humans learn. How humans learn. Let's talk about that. Thirdly, teachers will probably only change one thing a term. Get over it. Most adults find it hard to change how they eat, go to bed on time, and move. Why would you expect busy professionals, who are also often busy parents themselves, to be able to change multiple things at once? Focus on no more than one thing a term. Make sure it's one of the things that matters most to their instructional repertoire and stay on it until it becomes a natural part of practice. 4, teachers develop expertise like everyone else. Stop it with the inquiry cycles. When I came back in 2015, teachers were inquiring for 9 months on spirals and other things. Someone had told them that the evidence said that the best way for teachers to get better was to come up with their own problem of practice, inquire around what might help, talk to each other, spend 9 months, and then somehow change something? By midterm too, no one knew where they were up to in their 9-step spiral cycle. Teachers get better through deliberate practice. That's why I developed with colleagues the sprints model. Learn a new part of practice, understand why it works, spend 2 to 4 weeks trying to incorporate it into your instructional repertoire, and then use it forevermore until the evidence updates. And lastly, evidence-based practice and the formation of it in schools is a social process. And whilst we might talk with distance about medicine being a place where nurses and physiotherapists and doctors change their practice because their evidence changes, well, authors like Atul Gawande tell us that it's still actually a social process. And what I'm learning is it's very much about not just bringing in the expert or just holding up the person who's the hero of evidence in their school, but thinking carefully about who has standing in that common room, who has standing in that network, from whom might people actually feel they can learn from, and curating the social environment to use words that they understand, acknowledging that most primary school teachers haven't done an actual subject in science since they finished year 10. And we say you should get aligned with the science of learning, and they wonder whether that discipline knowledge is even something that they can engage in. Looking for the discussion.
Carl, you spoke a bit about a number of concepts around cognitive science and the like. Just we're lucky to have lots of educators in the room, but also others who are not involved in education on a day-to-day basis. And so, what are the couple of the key things for those general audience members about what the science of learning is about in ways that they might understand it?
It's a term I'm not particularly fond of because it incorporates a lot of very, very different fields, cognitive psychology, neuroscience. Rich Meyer says that the dominant view of how we learn, at least in education, has been constructivism, and this idea that minimally guided instruction, so that kids really learn things best when you create conditions under which they can sort of falter towards learning. When I first started teaching in an inner city London state school, very difficult behavior, it was sort of de rigueur that you would not talk for longer than 5 or... I even remember, some of you remember this, LEAs would have a timer when they're observing lessons, and if you talked for longer than 8 minutes, you were blacklisted. So the science of learning really, I think, is a shift away from that towards, first of all, seeing the mind as an information processing model, and really thinking hard about how do we attend to, process, encode, and retrieve knowledge. It's also, I think, the idea that learning is a change in long-term memory, and a kind of unashamed embracing of the fact that we want kids to remember things. We want them to remember them in the long term. And Simon, superb talk, and that idea of that kind of translation or that brokering of evidence is, I think, the place. To me now, the science of learning is not so much, as Miller says, working memory is limited to 7 plus or minus 2. That we've known that since the 50s. What we have much less of is, how should I use retrieval practice in my classroom? What's the ideal spacing time? What's the kinds of questions students should have? This is the work of the science of learning now.
And Simon, that's sort of the day job, I suppose, isn't it? How do we do that translation? Like this, there's a body of knowledge that Carl speaks to, that we've got quite a degree of confidence in much of that research in a research-based context. How do we translate that into the ways in which teaching practice can best make sense of and make use of that knowledge?
Well, focus group of one, and I know there's people who do this daily in their own schools with their own teams. I think the first thing is to say that just because we have a science of learning doesn't mean we have to tell the profession you need to teach aligned with the science of learning. And I just wonder whether or not we are in Australia just kind of grappling with this sense of the science of learning has done its job as a sort of front of the arrow of a call to say, are you up for evidence? And that's really people said, I'm up for evidence. That's what it means. But, when we think about nutritional science or health exercise science, I don't need to know, have I aligned with the science of nutrition? It's just like, have I eaten enough protein at breakfast? And there is this sense where I'm just wondering whether we can move to a situation where we can know when to use that type of language. And here I think about different epistemic communities. When I'm in this community, when I'm at a research conference, everyone likes to speak to each other with that sophisticated lexicon and show each other that we're in the loop and that we're using the sorts of names that Carl has talked about. But as we move out into the majority of our profession, there's not necessarily for me any need to say all of them need to be card-carrying science of learning people. I often find people should test different language. So I often find, do you think it makes sense to base the decisions in planning and classroom practice on evidence? Most people say, yeah, that makes sense. What else would I base it on? Maybe peer guidance, but that makes sense. If I say something like explicit instruction, why are we pushing necessarily something that the next sentence is, let me tell you what that isn't? Has anyone noticed this? Like the wonderful work that Aero, and I think Jenny's in the room. I've heard Jenny speak about this stunningly multiple times. She's been a huge asset in Victoria, coming and speaking. But guess what we have to do? You say, we're heading around explicit instruction. Let me tell you what explicit instruction isn't. And we have to say explicit instruction, explicit direct instruction. It's not this. What we mean is this. Is there anything else you try to convince 100,000 educators about where you have to, the second sentence, say, it's not this, it's really this? Now, I understand it's the term we use in the literature, but that's a big early translational challenge where the schema and the mental map for most people when they hear the word explicit is didactic, teacher-directed. And they have literally an aversion to that. Whereas if I say to people, hey, what do you think of the gradual release of responsibility? You go, oh, yeah. I say, last night, literally, I was sitting by the pool and my 7-year-old and 9-year-old were in there and I was watching the teacher pull them out and show butterfly to this older group and she would show it. She had one on the freaking ground on a mat, out of the pool, showing the action, correcting the action. Don't put her in the pool and do it. This is a hard stroke. Most of us still haven't. I said, if I think about the I do, we do, you do for butterfly, does this make sense? Has anyone sat on the pool for that week of swimming lessons? We do this in Australia a whole week every year with all our students. Does this make sense? Yeah, absolutely. And so I say, I do, we do, you do, maybe 1 or 2% pushback. I say explicit instruction in a typical group, maybe 70% pushback. So the first thing to say is, who are we trying to prove what to? And we need to know which epistemic community we're in. If we're in the research ed, sharing best practice, CIS kind of conversations, then riff your educational research knowledge all you want. But if you're talking with colleagues saying the number one thing is I want them to understand the core constructs and be on a path to shifting their practice because I know it's in their best interest, it'll make their teaching more efficient, more effective, and it's in the student's best interest. So one of the things here is playing with language. And just, I think as Australia, we're at this tipping point where it's almost what got us here may not get us there, because if we keep pushing the type of language that in some ways excludes many people, they don't feel like it's theirs, we are already seeing the rise of the anti-movement with their false prophets. And often it comes in the guise of things like, it's context. You said this stunningly. It's context. Oh, I know it's not what works, but what works where and under what conditions. And that's all contextual. It's close, you see. Or it's not the science of learning, it's the sciences of learning, which we'd agree, I hope. And people will sort of hold up this straw man of the science of learning. It's a one set piece of knowledge with very, very clear dogmatic ideas about what every teacher should do. And I think we're going to have to be very careful about whether that's the language to use in the next phase of the work.
Carl, you mentioned some of the sort of leading thinkers and researchers that I suppose have set the scene for some of the research that the science of learning is grounded within. Some of that decades old, and why is it that that's taken so long to go from an educational psychology journal article and become widely known only in maybe the last decade or two?
Because if your job is dependent on being wrong about something, then it's not in your interest to revise your beliefs based on evidence. And so my experience of, and again, any education academics in the room, apologies, but my experience was a very frustrating one. And it was looking at people who were really sociologists or philosophers, and kind of third-rate philosophers at that. And there was this sense of, political activism is not a form of instruction. And that kind of seemed to me to be the primary lever. And there was this, it wasn't just that I don't like cognitive science, it's that it's evil. And that if you promulgate this stuff, you're somehow a bad person. So it was this aligning cognitive science, and that's, I think what Simon is touching on as well, he's absolutely correct, that the evidence is not enough. You're not going to win people over by saying this is what the evidence says. And my sort of sense is that we can maybe use terms like equity. When we look at the impact of explicit instruction programs around the world, it does serve groups that have traditionally been underserved. And then I think that, we need a different route for teacher training. A lot of us are doing almost remedial work where we're kind of retraining people out of, it's like getting hold of Scientologists and reprogramming them out of something that they were in. And again, I think the good bit about the science of learning is not the evidence, it's the ideology. It's the idea that you update your beliefs based upon compelling evidence, based upon converging sources of evidence. And that's something that, you sort of rarely see in education departments. So I think that would be, and then lastly, I have friends who work in cognitive psychology departments. I mean, people like John Sweller, Paul, and they are, it's an extraordinary thing in a university where you have a department where teachers are trained, and in the same place you have a department that's looking at information processing, memory retrieval, spacing, and never the twain shall meet. I mean, it is just extraordinary. And also in education, there's an almost a disdainful attitude towards the science of learning. So again, the language is important, and framing it around things like equity and improved outcomes for pupils, I think, is the way to do it.
So, Simon, why is it that the visceral reaction that you mentioned that some teachers experience and feel and firmly believe? Why is that the case when some of this evidence, as I say, has been known for some time and exists in the same place in which they're undertaking their initial training?
Yeah, so I always come from this perspective, firstly, just asking people, so what do you want the ends of education to be? Let's see. If you're a primary educator, my wife's a primary school teacher, my mum's a primary school teacher, what do you want the ends of education for Homo sapiens around 11 or 12? What do you want those things to be? And they'll describe. And then I'm a former high school science teacher. So what do you reckon about 17 and 18-year-olds? And normally when they describe those things, it's quite holistic, right? When we think about education, our Catholic colleagues might use things like formation quite a lot. We'll use language like development. We'll talk about capabilities, about being ready for the future. If you listen to any graduation speech, and there's some wonderful principals in the room, some of the best speech givers around, and they'll talk about those 18-year-olds or those 12-year-olds leaving, it's always this holistic view of the human, of the whole person. And so what I find actually is the biggest challenge at the moment is this bridging between you can have that view and you also need to know about the precision around information processing or learning. And one of the things that I find of this pushback is like they say, no, but I'm talking about the holistic view of the human and what I'm trying to do in development. Anyone else kind of find this sense of they find it hard to bridge? I'm working on character. We're working on character formation here. Okay, but this thing feels quite narrow and technical and it's not big enough for me. So I think one of the things is the way that they describe the ends of education and the way that we describe things like memory. They also often think memory is memorization. Memorization is low-level things. So when we say everything's a change in long-term memory, they literally, when I talk to them, say, oh, it's like memorization. I'm like, no, like playing Bach on the cello would be in long-term memory. And they're like, what? Like being able to take a 2-point shot in netball is in long-term memory. And they think memory is memorization is low level. And so part of this is just understanding what is the knowledge structure, what are those things, and then helping them bridge that. And so, when we get to, do we have the same view of the ends of education? We often can agree. And then we can talk about the means by which we can get there. And you can reason out some of the things we're talking about. So you want to talk about creative, confident citizens, like in the Melbourne Declaration? Me too. Let's talk about how my perspective would lead us to get there. Let's think about how your perspective leads you to get there. So I think some of the bridging of the gap, but we've got to do a better job of being able to talk about holistic view of human development and formation, and then how this, specific piece of evidence can help us do part of that work. And often I find that people are in this camp, can't see that this camp is anything but a reductionist, narrow type view. And people in this camp are staring at this camp going, you've got no hope of doing that if you can't do this. And that's at the moment where we're not having proper dialogue.
I think we've got a lot of the stuff that we're interested in. I think we have a branding problem. So direct instruction, explicit direct instruction sounds awful.
Yeah. Do you want that done to you? No.
I'm going to see an oncologist to get explicit direct. It sounds awful. Whereas building thinking classrooms, who doesn't want to build a thinking classroom? Who doesn't? Discovery, project-based learning. These are wonderful sounding things. So I think there's that. And then the last thing is you got to keep the politics out of it. Nick Gibbs said that to me recently, and I was shocked that he said it because he's a politician himself, but he's setting up something now, and he's saying, you got to keep the politics out of it because immediately you just, so many people get turned off it. I think it was Hannah Arendt who said, in order to be progressive, education needs to be traditional. And so there's that fundamental paradox at the heart of it. And to me, a kind of more traditional model like explicit instruction does lead to more equitable, progressive outcomes.
Although I would say it's interesting here, wall-to-wall Labor governments, Victoria, the main state I'm working in, that I think is the state to watch in the public system is the Victorian system. It is moving so quickly in the last 1 year. The Victorian teaching and learning model 2.0. It's got based in collaboration with Aero. It talks about learning, and then it talks about planning, explicit instruction. So enabling learning, explicit instruction, and supported application and mastery. We've now released at the end of term 1 a set of sort of practice guides that get right down their table mats, literally, to sit there and have a conversation, sort of like the one pages that have come out elsewhere. And there's a real move. And so I would say that it's a Victorian Labor government being driven entirely by that minister. And that's one lesson I've learned. If you want to move a system, move the minister. It's the quickest way to get the whole public service moving. So we're seeing that happen in Victoria. I think Jason Clare is definitely connecting equity, funding, and evidence, at least in rhetoric. So I think here in Australia, we're at least not in a situation where evidence is seen as politically right. And, and other forms is left. And I think that's a really exciting place to be. And I think the Catholics are moving fastest, partially because of their size, but also they are a little bit apolitical and they can think beyond a political cycle. So in my work with Melbourne Catholics, you're laughing about them being apolitical. I got it.
Politician and Catholic educator, so there's a bit of both there.
Melbourne Catholics, under the leadership there, they've got a 2030 vision, which all of this has to be long-term thinking, right? I'm 10 years back from the UK and I'm just like, I'm just getting started. I got to dedicate another 30 years to this work. And so there's a sense where Max can say, we're on a 2030 vision, yet in the public system in Victoria, they say, got 2 more years before maybe a political change. And that kind of being able to do long-term work in the apolitical, I think, is what the Catholics are being able to set. Multiple year cycles, half-decade cycles of work that are not... People aren't hedging, but if we get a political change in a year and a half, we're going to have to maybe be ready for a shift.
Sorry, Glenn, when did you come here, back from England?
2014.
So I think the other thing, very quickly, was happening was this grassroots movement. So you had things like Research Ed, bloggers who were really kind of reaching out and speaking in a language that teachers understood. And that was
we didn't get that for 5 more years.
Yeah. So you had this sort of pincer movement that I think was quite powerful. And that's where I think teacher voice came out quite strongly.
Yes.
And of course, in this room, we've heard from many of the people that are sort of being commented on, throughout the course of the discussion here. So Nick Gibb was in this room last year speaking to that reform movement. But we've also heard from others in the English system that have played a role throughout. The Catherine Berbel-Sings, the Amanda Spielmans, the Tom Bennetts, of course, have all joined us in this room as well, speaking
All
to
Satanists.
That's on the record, by the way. So we do have lots of school leaders and educational thought leaders in the room. So I do want to dedicate time to your questions.
My question or concern, and thank you, Carl, for highlighting that the knowledge of learning has been around for 130 years, which is one of my common reflections. My concern more is, how do we make sure this is not just the next fad? And so the nature of this conversation has been really helpful. I prefer to use evidence-based practice, and that helps to some extent to shift the conversation. I prefer to use phrases like professional standards because they apply across professions. And in Australian education, and I'm not an educator by background, I do ponder that same question. Why or how did we get into this? I come from an industrial background, and my reflection is often that I think the character of the industrial organisation of teaching hasn't shifted in Australia. And when you talk about the flexibility or the freedom that Catholic systems have, we're not quite as constrained. And I loved the reference to Gibb, but also the don't get political, because the federal election that we just went through, one of my standard reflections to my colleagues was, we're not engaging in the curriculum wars. That was the latest attempt to politicise something that could have been quite unhelpful about improving the standards of education in Australia. So any reflections on any of that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.
Well, maybe I'll take this idea of how do we make sure it's not just the next fad, right? So earlier this year, I'm midlife, and I was looking at the evidence, and it's evidently you're meant to, lift weights or something. Otherwise, I will be older before I need to be. And a dear friend of mine, Adam Fraser, told me to go to the gym, and I went to the gym for 4 weeks, 3 times a week. And I said to him, I've been going 3 times a week. And he said, great. I said, what do I do next? And he said, do it for the rest of your life. My view is that we're building what medicine built 70 years ago plus, which is the ecosystem of evidence, which is the connection where there's the primary evidence, which I normally use science of learning to talk about, the primary research and cognitive science and other forms of educational psychology that can feed into the translational work that departments do, but also other individuals do, and then into the professional learning structures whereby each and every term, every educator is getting to engage with evidence and take the next step. So one of the things we've got to do is not somehow just get everyone up to speed with cognitive load theory, but actually get everyone up to speed that we are now going to be an evidence-informed profession, and this is now just a part of what we do. And so building schools and systems that have ways for evidence to get in and professional learning structures whereby it's normal for everyone to be engaging in this work. So that would be the first thing. Like the real work is building the internal architecture and system for ongoing engagement with evidence. And then secondly, I would stay away from anything that's still highly contested. Because people don't understand how science works, the big pushback we're getting is science of learning is dogma, which is just incredible, right? It's like, no, by nature, this is an ongoing updating piece of work. You'll see people on the other side saying, ha, cognitive load theory has been proven false, because they find one article. And I was like, of course, a quarter of the studies on feedback say it makes learning worse. Of course this is. And anyone who's trained in science is knowing this is an ongoing piece. So one of the things I would say is don't lead with the types of things that might get updated quickly. And I've learned this from my friend Tom Sharrington, and one of the reasons why Rosenstein's principles has been so useful is because it summarized some of the things that have been around for the longest time. So I would say, for the first 3 to 4 years, can you get people to work on the things that we have the strongest confidence in, such that they use it, they get some benefit from it, and someone in 6 months doesn't say, oh no, the evidence for that's changed now. Because that gives them that confidence that it is worthy of my time and effort to deliberately incorporate this into my repertoire, rather than jumping off to something that's like the newest research. I'm like, oh, please don't do anything on the newest research in the first 3 or 4 years. because there is at least a chance that then that updates and we go, oh, actually the finding isn't as strong as we thought. And that deflates their feeling of putting discretionary energy into that whole project. So they're the two things I would say: build the system and school infrastructure for being evidence informed from now and forevermore. And secondly, do the first few years of evidence on things that we have the strongest, that's been stood up to the critique, so that we're not telling educators, oh, sorry, yeah, we did that, but it's been updated now, which for most educators who don't understand the process of science, they just find that frustrating and deflating, and it will feel a lot like Brain Gym and the other things they did and got taken away from them.
Yeah, Carl, I want you to respond as well, but also to I guess pick up on that idea that how do we create that willingness to engage with a changing science against the core way in which teachers want to think, it's just get something set and forget and be able to continue to implement. But what we're talking about is actually a continual engagement with science. How do we do those things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between getting something to work in a laboratory and then getting it to work at scale in a school. So Benjamin Bloom talked about the 2 sigma problem in the 60s, which is the most effective kind of intervention we have is one-to-one tutoring. But it's an impossible thing to, we're not going to be able to afford to have one-to-one tutors for schools. So I think claims need to be testable. They need to be falsifiable. There needs to be a convergence of evidence, not just one study or even one meta-analysis. And they need to have a record of improving outcomes for students in a range of different situations. So in terms of being the next fad, well, the stuff we're talking about has been there since the 50s. Project Follow-Through, the unfortunately titled Project Follow-Through, was an evaluation of direct instruction, which is a 10-year longitudinal study. And it found that that program was by far and away the most effective for reading, for spelling, and even for well-being. There was this obsession with self-efficacy in the 60s, and there was programs dedicated to making kids feel better about themselves, and they did worse than the kids who were learning how to read and write. Surprise, surprise, you learn how to read and write and you feel better and more confident about yourself. Those types of studies, those types of programs, but we're not going to be a profession when everybody's just choosing their own adventure. You wouldn't go to your if you went to your dentist and he said, you know what, I know what all the evidence says, but these healing crystals, I really like, they really work for me, so I'm gonna do that. That's what's happening in a lot of schools where teachers are they're privileging their own comfort over the development of the students in front of them. And until that changes, and that is you made the very good point about professionalism. If we use a language like, okay, this forget about science of learning, forget about explicit instruction, let's talk about professionalism, and agreed professionalism. Let's talk about equity. How do we improve outcomes for those marginalized students in our society? And it is not discovery learning, it's not project-based learning.
There's a few questions from the floor over here, then Ian, then Peter.
Hi, guys. A bit of an IT question, I guess. I'm on the ground out southwestern Sydney, teacher advisor 3 days a week, and then at uni, teaching a subject. And they asked me to teach English a couple of years ago, and I looked at the assignments and the course and just said, I'm not teaching that. My question is, do you have much, I know you're at uni as such, but across the board in Australia, we've got 1,000 teachers out on prac right now, but they're learning on the ground because of the courses that we're doing. Like, what is your influence in the university area, if any? Because we're chasing our tails. Across Australia, we could have 10,000 teachers coming out, but they've got to be retrained when they're on the ground.
Yeah, so we'll go. We're going to take the next one from Ian and then Peter, and then we'll go to we'll take one more as well. We'll take a collection of 4 of them, so take some notes as best you can.
Many thanks. My name's Ian. I'm an academic in linguistics at Macquarie University. I'm very interested in how children learn how to write, and what Simon said, I think, is absolutely true. We're sort of reaching a stalemate in the academic debate, and one of the most important ways forward, I think, is that success will be the best demonstration of the strength of our case. And perhaps one thing that we could think about would be to maybe establish like a demonstration school based on the science of learning for high school or primary school. I mean, this kind of thing was a tradition in the US. And that would be a demonstration to parents in the public education system about just what a wonderful way of education this sort of science of learning is. That would, I think, generate a remarkable amount of like electoral goodwill. People would want to know how these results were achieved, and that would be something that would also, I think, then feed back into the higher education institutions, because they could also be having teachers trained in those systems and then percolating out into the broader system. So perhaps a policy proposal we could think about.
Great. We'll go Joanna, then Peter.
Joanna Barbusis. I'm the Dean and Provost Chancellor at La Trobe University, and taking up the ITE. I think I'm the only Dean here. Taking your point, Simon, let's not expect a teacher to do everything all at once in terms of change. Think of one thing and stick to that sort of transformation. I think we're in an interesting space in teacher education in Australia, different to the UK. Something that, and I talk to Nick very regularly, and he's part of my next little project. Nick's point, if I had a university like La Trobe, I would have done things differently. And I do think that the university sector has a role to play, and particularly the work that we've done at La Trobe and the influence that you talk about, Victoria. It has been directly with the work that we've done. And I do think there's, I mean, you know, my colleagues here will say, I was pretty clear as a dean up front, we're going to do things differently. I was kind of, you know, taken out of the dance cards and invitation lists. But now there's a shift that's happening where deans and leaders are actually coming to us and saying, how did you do that? And that transformation of change is about leadership and how you shift from, you could have a great idea, but culture eats strategy. And if you don't get people on board, and the points that you're making is so pertinent, because it's the naysayers. If you can convince the naysayers to shift and think about things slightly differently, we still have a lot of work to do in our own school, but there are conversations that you have should be not about your manifesto, but actually how you see, you meet people at where they are, to then they either decide, I can't do this, I'm out, or I can do this, but can we think about like that? And other opportunities for discussion comes into play. But I do think and keen to get your view, particularly from you, Simon, for the reforms to have impact in this country, the universities have to come on board. And it's how do we position that onboarding to really bring about change.
Thanks, Joanna. And then just Peter as well here. And then we'll get some reactions across the board from our panel.
Thank you very much. Peter Sherquist is my name. The first point I'd like to make is that he's talked about demonstration schools. Pymble Ladies College is now working with Tagai College up in the Torres Strait. And the incentive there is that for students to come to school all day, every day, all term, they will have the opportunity to come to Pymble Ladies College to board for 1 week in the September-October school holidays. So the issue there is that the Tagai and PLC are working together to improve the teaching and the aspirations and the attendance numbers. So that's a very exciting outcome, and that's resulting from Warren Mundine's terrific paper last year in terms of school attendance in remote areas. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is last week I spent 2 days at EduTech here in Sydney, launching a new website that Professor David Christian has produced, taken 7 years to produce it. It's the extension of a big history, but he's done it for grade 5 or upwards. So that's been really interesting. At that conference, and anybody wants the card, I can give you that afterwards. At that conference, I noticed the amazing interest in AI by teachers, and they were all struggling to complete their workload, which is what they can see AI helping them. But then on the other hand, they had trouble with students using AI to deceive them and write papers. So there's a whole issue there that's only happened in the last couple of years, where AI is now taking control, or not control, taking a major situation in the school system. So I'd like you to comment on that point in particular. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for all those contributions and questions. So I guess a direction around ITE broadly, the role for using success to tell the story, and how I suppose teachers often respond to that type of evidence. The role for cultural change, including around naysayers, and very briefly around AI. That's a whole conversation itself. Simon, then Carl.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And Joanna, I'll kick off with you. Thanks for your leadership. I mean, everyone's a copycat of La Trobe now. But I think the great danger of this is, so Victoria is an example, as departments have started to shift and people are saying, the Solar Lab, Joanna's speaking at state conference 2 weeks ago, they're rebadging what they're doing, but they're not reculturaling or building any knowledge. We have experts in mathematics who've been teaching in Victoria models of Launch Explore, all front end that breaks our kind of understanding of cognitive load, and suddenly they'll rebadge themselves as cognitive load. So we're seeing a huge amount of rebadging, and thank you for your long-term leadership. The danger now is that people won't do the reculturing that you've done, and they'll do the rebadging. What it looks like under the review that Mark Scott led and others is that all universities are adding things around the science of learning, but it's just this module here. What matters, to pick up your point, is it's impractical. People say, that's just a unit you have to do, but the critical sociologists, the philosophers, the Bourdieu experts, the Foucaultian experts, they're still doing the majority of the teaching. And so it's sort of this, it's there, it's ticked off, but it's not the apprenticeship in the problem solving of how would I use this understanding to understand the problems I've just experienced in my first practicum, and where might we turn in the science of learning to find solutions to that. So, my first big point is like leadership. And, there's 3 J's in the room: Joanna, Jennifer, and Jenny. That is Jennifer Buckingham and Jenny Donovan. Like, these people have put literally decades. We've got to say it's going to be decades of long-term leadership that each of us need to kind of put into this to do this type of work. And we've got to realize that as the money from governments is starting to align with this, and federally, you're going to get a lot of copycat and a lot of rebadging. So we have to watch for that. We have to call it out. Briefly, I just saw Ian's point about success. I've thought a lot about this as who we're willing to learn from. When my kids didn't sleep, I had 3 kids under 4. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's good now. I didn't want to learn from another parent who said my kids have slept through since week 3. Because you were lucky genetically, you were lucky this, you were lucky this. I want to learn from people that it works 2 out of 3 times, but I'm not sure about this. And Australians in particularly want to learn from humble successes. Demonstration schools don't work, in my mind, because as soon as you call a demonstration school, people say the causal reasons why that works is certain kids, certain teachers, certain conditions. If we had that, we could do it too. No learning occurs. So for me, it's often about finding schools that you can learn from, that people feel like they're enough like me that I feel like I could get on that path, and often getting people to learn from a school that's 1 year from now, not 5 years from now. And so we don't want to learn from the schools that have been implementing this without the systems necessarily, but we want to tag you with a school that's 18 months from where you are now, because that's the social relationship that I find people are open to. And I think if we do demonstration schools, we want to get schools that are using the preconditions and the staff arrangements and the funding and the collaboration that's normal in other places. Otherwise, I don't find that we can learn from them. And then lastly, the AI thing, I think I want to go back to Carl's point around one of the reasons why teachers are so flat out is they're doing a lot of things that aren't core business. Small plug. I did a book called Pruning, because de-implementations is utterly important to this, but no one wants to say a 6-syllable letter and a 6-syllable word. And it's, again, like explicit teaching. No one says, let's go to the de-implementation meeting. Woohoo, right? But pruning was about, we got to cut back for future growth. And so I actually think the problem with AI is people think, oh, let's just leave everything we're doing without prioritization. And then hopefully the AI is going to help us find the time we need. You find the time you need by prioritization and working out what are the essential things that move the needle. And I'm seeing a dystopian future already where busy teachers are getting AI to write a rubric without working out all the hard work of working out what good looks like. Kid receives set rubric, leaves assignment till last day, puts into ChatGPT, write me an assignment that will get a 7 out of 10 on this rubric. Teacher then feeds assignment back in to mark against it. And the whole thing was, it was never about the product, it was all about the thinking. So for me, the big thing with teaching is about prioritizing the essential things that matter and engaging in the intellectual preparation of what do I want these students to learn and what would good quality look like. And then on the other side, that students realize it's not ever about the actual final product, it's about the thinking processes and the hard thinking. And unfortunately, humans will avoid hard thinking. That's one of the other findings we know from science of learning. We're going to save that energy resource. The brain uses a lot of resource. And so teachers will often use AI to avoid the hard essential thinking, and students will use AI to avoid the hard essential thinking. And so I think there's a real danger about the pedagogical uses of AI, although I'm quite open to the productivity uses of AI.
Thanks very much. And I might just, while we're in interest of plugging, Carl mentioned some of the important work in Mississippi. For those who follow us on YouTube, you can see a discussion that we hosted here with Carrie Wright about the Mississippi miracle, as we describe it, and to Simon's point around the importance around case study examples in terms of science of learning. I think stay tuned for some work from us in the next 12 months that will speak to science of learning implementation in very different contexts, not just, if you like, the textbook example of a school that's been doing it for 15 years, but the school that's on the way there. So I think that's our reflection of also agreeing that that's an important part of that journey. Carl?
On the idea about, I can't remember the phrase you used, expert schools, or was it? Lab, like a lab school. Yeah. So this was one of Dewey's good ideas over 100 years ago. He called them research schools. And the key thing was that these would be places of reflective practice. So it wouldn't be just, this is how it's done, everyone needs to do it. And I think that's just not part of the mission of being a teacher, and it has never been. And I think that's where there's a difference between other professions. Even in, I work with different people in different industries now, and they regularly have a space where they evaluate the latest evidence. How can we apply it? How can we use it? How can we get improved? The nearest thing we have, I think, is instructional or responsive coaching. The second point was
ITE, cultural change, naysayers.
Oh yeah, Latrobe, big fan. Pam Snow is one of my heroes, one of my favorite people in the world. Yeah, I think that's. There should be alternative routes, I think, to teacher training as well. Why are teachers leaving the profession in their droves? Why are teachers not, voting to be a teacher? We have a recruitment, and when you look at the data, it's an extraordinary how it's just almost the same everywhere. We are not able to keep teachers, and when you look at my hunch is that many teachers went through COVID, and we're seeing how their husbands and wives and friends were working, and going, hang on, you work a day a week from home? Hang on, you've got small kids, you're able to take these days off? Teaching, it became obvious to teachers that it's the only job where you have to be there 5 days a week and you're not allowed to leave. So if you are, why would you go into that profession now? Why would you go into that profession when there's more heaped on you all the time? The behavior is shocking. Which leads me to the AI point. I've been a vocal critic of technology in education for a long time, but I think this is different. And I think that there's things that align with the science of learning. So brilliant point by Simon that if we want kids to learn things, as Dylan Williams says, the point of feedback is to improve the student and not the work. And if they're just producing stuff without thinking, then that's bad. However, I was looking at a paper on curriculum design and AI-generated curricula. So a big thing that we're only starting to get our hands on now is teachers are very bad curriculum designers. It's a very bespoke skill. It's very difficult to get right. And AI is now generating curriculum that are extraordinarily good. So one trial I saw was an experiment where curriculum designers were unable to tell the difference. So if that's true, that's going to shave off maybe 30% of teacher workload. And again, if we're going back to recruitment and retention, the big one for me is marking and feedback. Yep. And the work of Daisy Christodoulou and No More Marking Comparative Judgment is extraordinary. In terms of, if you were to give this covenant to teachers now coming into the profession, we're going to shave off the 30% where you're, on Pinterest Sunday night trying to cobble together a retrieval quiz. And we're going to take off the other end of it, which is the marking on a Sunday, the 2 hours marking that you do, which the kids don't even read, and is a expensive public relations exercise. We're going to allow you to focus on the instruction. That's the interaction with the kids, your subject knowledge. We're even going to get rid of writing reports home. There's no reason for you to, there's no point in doing that. That's an exciting thing. And I think that would, EdTech, Larry Cuban is brilliant on this. The history of EdTech is just a history of expensive failures. A lot of it is digitized versions of resources that didn't even work in the first place. But this is genuinely different. And I think it does align with a lot of the things we're discussing here today around curriculum assessment and instruction.
So we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Simon and Carl.
Thank you.
Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the critical area of education. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.